And then visited
And City Club is going to do their
which is also deserty and different.
We're going to resume.
I get an invitation again, I'll send it. Yeah, you would love that. That would really give you a window.
Things.
I'm going to do
And
that
then
now.
went to some hot springs. That was really good. Played some golf. Just had fun. And
Okay.
like self
We're going to resume the hearing, recap 7 work plan. Morgan and, oh, you're not Phil.
You know, I'm going to kick it off.
Oh, okay.
If we're ready to go.
Joe.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Joe Zender, Chief Planner for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. And tonight, we're going to have a hearing on the Recap 7 work program. Recap stands for Regulatory Improvement Code Amendment Package. And that's why we call it Recap, because it's shorter and friendlier. You all recall we just completed Recap 6, and the short-term rental regulations that were part of that are going to go into effect this Friday. So that one we've just wrapped up, and we're launching on the next of the recaps. And what recaps are intended to be are packages of a number of code provisions that really do not cross over into making major policy changes, but they're things that are making it difficult to implement the code or administer the code down in the Permit Bureau. Inevitably, some of these creep into policy questions, and part of our discipline is to try to keep them on the small side. Arguably, we missed that mark when we talked about short-term rentals, because that ended up being pretty big. But you can see sort of the tension. Something looks small and it can get big. But this time, we think we have a program that's more focused on process and regulatory improvement. And also this time, we've crafted an agreement with the Bureau of Development Services that really looks at the fact that many of the things that are even on our regulatory improvement list are those bigger projects. And so that we want a way to sort of tackle those as well. And so in addition to the recap, which you're going to hear about tonight, we're also going to be undertaking, and the recaps we hope to get done in 12 months. We're undertaking a larger code project with BDS support, and that one this year is going to focus on accessory structures and ADUs. And and we'll come back in and talk to you or give you a briefing on the scoping of that project as well. With that tonight, we're going to hear from Kristen Cooper, who is a senior planner at BDS, who's going to provide us with a little background on recap, and then Morgan Tracy is going to go over the minor policy and work plan items themselves, and then we'll have a public hearing. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Kristen Cooper with the Bureau of Development Services. So the regulatory improvement process begins with entries made into the regulatory improvement database, and that's just a storehouse of regulatory improvement requests. They can be very large or they can be very small, and they get entered into this database from a variety of sources. There's links on both the BPS and the BDS website, and they can also come as requests from the public through comments at public meetings or report recommendations. But many of the items are entered by BDS or by BPS, by planners, as issues or questions arise in implementing the zoning code. And these are planners who work with the zoning code every day and are very aware of problems with the zoning code, like confusing, unclear language, or code sections that make it difficult to administer, and they result in challenges or arguments, disagreements, and then frustration for applicants, for the public, for neighborhoods, and for staff, and also are end up taking up a lot of staff time that could be better spent. So the clarifications to the zoning code sections that are identified in Recap 7 are helping BDS to administer and implement the code. And I just wanted to add that many of the items that are entered have recommended solutions. There's some where there's cross-references in the code that are to the wrong section number or something like that. But there's a lot of items that are entered that It's just unclear what the intent of the language is. The language isn't quite getting there, and so there aren't solutions identified, just a request for clarification. So there's currently around 453 open items. 303 fall into the technical or minor policy requests that could be part of a recap package. The other items are really much larger ones, and they can get considered through ongoing legislative projects, or they may call for process improvements versus regulatory improvements, and then they're referred to other, some of them are referred to other bureaus to address if they're not zoning code items. So as Joe said, the recap projects are really not like other legislative regulatory projects. They're not single topic. They're not specific to certain parts of the city, and they don't tackle the big policy questions. They're zoning code cleanups of a variety of unrelated issues. They affect the daily implementation of the code. They're more discrete items, and they're more technical in nature. And just to point out that with the comp plan work underway, even the minor policy items included in the recap were considered to be not ones that would be affected by comp plan implementation. So the way that items were put together into this work plan package proposal was by a smaller committee of planners from BPS and BDS who are familiar with the regulations, looking at the items that had been entered over time and really over the last year, ones that hadn't been ranked. And the ranking criteria are here. So the first one has to do with the variety of stakeholders. So are there a large variety of stakeholders for the regulation, or is it a single special interest? How many people or projects are impacted by the regulation? And so a higher number on the scale would result in a higher number for the item. The geographic applicability is there a single site or situation at hand, or does it affect multiple properties citywide or all properties within a zone? The degree of impact means how much return is there for looking at the item? Does the item occur frequently, or what's the impact of the confusion over the item, and how much does it involve in cost, review time, or the amount or level of misunderstanding that results. Then the regulatory improvement is how easily can the regulation be improved? Is it overly complex or rigid? Is it often misunderstood, or is it fairly easy to clarify? So Recap 7 has 7 minor policy changes of the 45 total items. These were items that ranked higher when we went through the criteria. And then they were also ones that weren't going to be affected by the comp plan implementation. And they were also sort of looking at Recap as being staffed basically by one person, one FTE, how many things and the level of complication that could be handled by one person or one FTE. So the higher ranking, and then also to get back to what Joe said about the other projects that are kind of more of packages like accessory structures, there's several accessory structure items that might have been ranked higher or might have qualified as minor policy, but since there's this other project going on, they got folded into that. So these were more standalone and smaller, more discrete minor policy changes. And then there's 38 technical clarification items, and these are generally automatic adds to the package that are really small, would take minimal time to research what the code's trying to achieve. And they're really just technical corrections, clarifications, and changes to ensure greater consistency.
And if you're wondering who the one FTE is, that would be me. So, so I wanted to give a little background on what those minor policy items are. This is where we usually get more of the attention. There's a little bit of potential for a shift from our established practice or policy. So this first item has to do with revisions to approved design review projects. And often, construction issues will arise following design review approval. For type 3 reviews, this can be particularly problematic because it requires a new pre-application conference, which is about $4,300, and generally another hearing is required. So depending on the extent of the revision to the approved project, this could be appropriate, but often the revisions are negligible to the overall design. So this particular item will be looking at evaluating alternative review thresholds, perhaps a type 2 process, or alternative processes for modifying already approved projects. Pre-application conferences are intended to help guide application submittals, but pre-app meeting requests are allowed to be submitted at the same time the application itself is submitted. So this concurrent submittal partly defeats the purpose of having a pre-app, but also creates problems because the pre-app notes are a required submittal item for the application itself. So this can create issues for the completeness review on staff. So this item, we're looking at whether pre-application conferences have to be held prior to actually submitting the application. The code refers to floor area in two different contexts. It looks at it as a way to regulate building scale and bulk as a floor area ratio. It also looks at it as a way to limit amounts of particular land uses on a site, such as limiting retail uses to 3,000 square feet. The definition for floor area does not distinguish between these two approaches, which has led to confusion and some unintended consequences. For example, floor area excludes basements, roof area, porches, and vestibules, which may be good for determining overall building bulk and scale, but it's not so good in terms of limiting particular uses. So for this item, a household is defined as any number of related family members plus no more than 5 additional people. The definition also includes any number of handicapped persons plus no more than 5 additional persons. And this has created a situation where large assisted living or facilities for the physically disabled are no longer classified as group living situations and therefore not reviewed as conditional uses. Without a conditional use review, these larger facilities can be out of scale and not appear residential in character. And generally, we've had in the past the practice of treating facilities with 5 or fewer residents as an allowed use in a single dwelling zone, and larger than that requiring conditional use review. But more recent review by our city attorneys has led to this confusion or different interpretation where we're no longer treating them as conditional uses. For this item, the code defines height measurement methodology for hipped, mansard, gambrel, and flat roofs, but does not reflect more modern roof shapes like shed or butterfly shaped roofs. That'd be like looking like this. This item will examine ways to clarify how to measure height for these different roof types and make it more explicit in the code. As a related height issue, this item will look at how the code currently establishes reference points for measuring height of all buildings. We use a base point 1 or base point 2 methodology or an average grade above the street. This sort of establishes where to start the measurement up to the roof height. It'll also look at how other cities address this height measurement. So the product, in this case, we're not going to propose an actual amendment to the code, but we'll develop a research or white paper that'll help inform subsequent larger code projects. Because basically what's happened in the past is this is an item or an issue that comes up repeatedly, requires more resources than the particular project that's working through the issues, the broader issues of the legislative project. Doesn't have enough time to really get into the nitty-gritty detail research for different height methodologies. And so we're trying to get this particular piece set up so that another subsequent legislative project can pick it up and take it through a more extensive stakeholder process. Otherwise, this would turn into something like the short-term rentals, I think. This last minor policy item is actually more of a cleanup item left over from the tree project. If you recall, that was several years ago in 2011 when we adopted that. In that project, invasive or nuisance species trees or no longer allowed to be planted in streets or on city properties. The Ladd's Addition Historic Guidelines Street Tree Plan calls for planting the Norway maple, which will no longer be permitted. The tree project added a footnote to the guidelines that nuisance trees may not be planted. However, the street tree plan itself, which is shown on the slide there, still indicates specific tree species, and this has not been updated, which can lead to some confusion. So our objective here is to review that street tree plan and substitute the specific species with more general characteristics of the desired street tree look for those streets. There are 38 additional technical items that generally they don't affect current policy. They don't need specialized outreach or much analysis beyond the background research, as Kristen noted. So they're typically added to the recap work plan automatically. So unless there are particular issues that you have or questions you have, I'll move on. We can come back. So next.
I got one quick
Oh
question.
yeah,
Question.
let's hear.
Just on the item 2, concurrent pre-application land use submittals. Are you talking, just so I understand, for example, somebody precluding the ability to put in your design review application at the same time as your pre-application?
That's what, yeah, exactly.
And at the same time, are you going to look into time periods for those processes?
Which particular
Well,
part of
in general, the design review process tends to be growing in the length of time. And that might be a broad statement, and maybe it's not really happening, but maybe that needs to be looked into, because as applicants are seeing that process take longer, they're trying to shortcut their time period to still have the overall process of getting through land use review take the same amount of time.
Right, so there's a couple prongs to the answer to that. So the first is we're looking at, just in general, in cases where you're coming back for a revision to a design review that's already been approved, we're looking at ways to kind of condense that time period through a different process. But to answer the question about an initial design review project, we are embarking on sort of an audit of our design review processes and the tools that we use for design review, the guidelines and so the design standards. That will kind of set us up for, Joe didn't mention this, and we haven't really come to a full agreement on what that next larger project will be, but a potential option for that next larger project after the accessory structures is looking at the design review tools.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, there could be years in difference of understanding how you've now precluded concurrent applications before you understand if you're going to be any changes to the design review process, yet this is potentially shortening or increasing the timeline for development projects going through the land use review process.
It could very well do that. If you look at the purpose of having the pre-application conferences to provide the applicants with enough background and input from staff initially before you've invested a lot of time in your application submittal, so that you don't end up with an application that then is protracted through the process to get to an approvable stage. So the pre-application conference is intended to kind of speed you up at the tail end of that by pointing out, raising red flags at the initial part of that. So if you're coming in with your pre-app request before and your application before you've had your pre-app, then it's sort of self-defeating the purpose of the pre-app.
I completely agree with that, but I also think there are many applicants who understand the process and know what's needed to get through as a completeness review, and this is effectively kind of affecting that whole development timeline. And it's just important. I'm not saying we need to resolve it tonight. It's just something to think about as you're looking at it and trying to understand the implications of it.
I appreciate you raising that point. It is something we're going to have to look at. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So in terms of next steps, sort of getting to Catherine's point. So next thing is we're going to start looking at these things. Staff will analyze the issues and begin developing code amendment proposals. We'll conduct some targeted meetings with stakeholders, that relate to the specific topics at hand. In early winter, we'll release a public discussion draft and conduct more general outreach to neighborhood associations, coalitions, and so forth. We'll then return to this commission in the spring of next year with our proposed draft, and ultimately be at City Council for adoption of the amendments in June. So finally, staff is recommending the Planning and Sustainability Commission approve the Recap 7 work plan dated August 2014, and we will then commence with our research and analysis. We're available for any questions you may have.
Questions? Chris?
So we've had some written testimony essentially about the public involvement components of this process, and I want to probe at that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think there's some general criticism that the public isn't involved enough at any of the steps, but I think very specifically on the front end in building the recommended list of projects, and at least I read it as this is very internally city staff focused about what makes things easier and faster to process as opposed to necessarily what will benefit the community the most. And I guess I'd ask you to tell us, what community input was there? I mean, we've heard about the database, but beyond the database, was there any other community input in prioritizing the list? And are the criteria we're using responsive to community needs?
So I guess, though, a different way to respond to that is looking at recaps versus other legislative projects. So at their root, recap is generally I like to use the metaphor of a tune-up on a car. It's when you go to the mechanic, you kind of turn the car over, and the mechanic does whatever it is to keep the car running. It's necessary, important. If you didn't do it, your car would stop working. That's kind of the function that recap serves for the codes. Legislative projects are they're looking forward, right? They're looking at what are the issues on the ground? How do we address them? How are we proactive? And we necessarily need more voices at the table to start sussing out how that looks, right? When we're talking about, that's why it's sort of a more technical in nature process. And it's frustrating, I think, for members of the public because at least last year and initially for this year, we're kind of the only project that's dealing with code at the moment. There's a couple other projects that are coming on board, and I think there's going to be a lot of excitement about those. In terms of outreach to the public, we did do a briefing with DRAC, Development Review Advisory Committee, back in June. We shared the list of work plan items at that point. We've had the work plan on our website since early August. And while we've received a lot of testimony complaining, or at least concern expressed about the process and not being involved, we haven't heard any suggestions for other items to consider as part of our work plan. And that's in part what the work plan hearing process is for. And on top of all that, there are additional constraints in terms of the amount of time that we have to commit to the items at hand. And we're sort of in this weird in between the old comp plan and the new comp plan and trying to stay out of the way of some of these other comp plan issues. So a lot of the issues that we're hearing in our Bureau, concerns that we're hearing from the public, really would start stepping on the toes of some of the comp plan implementation projects. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
So one follow-up, and then I'll let Mike go. So some of the testimony contrasted the current process with the process more towards the original inception of the recap, when there was a specific stakeholder committee around recap. When did that get dropped off, and what was the rationale?
Yeah, so prior to recap 6, we had recaps 1 through 5 and 5A and 5B. There was a standing RESAT, the Regulatory Improvement Stakeholder Advisory Team. And that was in part possible because we had an ongoing funding source. So this program, is ongoing. We had a standing committee that thankfully was able to stay with us year after year after year. That changed when they ended funding for recap in 2010, and we took a 4-year hiatus. When we started recap 6, it was a one-time fund. Recap 7 is also a one-time fund. And the nature of trying to establish a stakeholder committee, there's about a 3 or 4 month lead time to do that, to select the members, to appoint them, to get everything organized and get people showing up. Considering the items that we're evaluating through recap 6 and 7, this sort of disparate, wide-ranging, not topic-specific, there's no real good bundles. A complaint we heard in the reset process was, you know, we want to get to the more meaty stuff. We want to talk about the bigger issues, and that's not what recap is. Or we'd have people that were feeling that they were spending their time not addressing issues that were relevant to them. That, you know, this is my particular topic, or that's my particular topic, but with this sort of disparate grab bag of issues, it's hard to get a good stakeholder team together to represent all those items. It's not to say it's a bad idea. I think when we have a little more direction from our comp plan, we can start working on some of these other beefier issues. Again, we've got another 200 minor policy items outstanding in our database, and we're dealing with about 7 at a time. When we start dealing with more of those minor policy items and we have a sort of more reliable source of funding for the program, then we can establish a stakeholder committee and try to do these bundles that make more sense for that kind of stakeholder involvement.
You know, if I could just add briefly to it, we're sort of in a different place today than we were back when the recap project started. Both the Bureau's half the size that was, and we're undertaking more work than we probably were then, honestly, in a weird way, between the Central City Plan and the Comprehensive Plan update. And out of both of those long-term planning projects, we really are charting a course that's kind of defining our work program for the next few years, because we're going to see those projects through and implement them, right? We're adopting a comp plan, we'll adopt a Central City Plan, and embedded in there are big code and implementation projects that we're going to want to follow through on. So that developing of the work plan for the Bureau is really, I think, what the process complaint is. And we look to the Planning and Sustainability Committee to be commission to be the body that we sort of do that with, and we use it in our work plan development and our budget process as well. We want to keep the recap database alive and sort of relevant, so directing more of the issues that continue to come up and will always come up with administration of the code to that, so that we can keep that fresh and keep it relevant and get to the bigger ones. That's an important thing to continue to do in this sort of next round, this current generation of recap. And as Morgan said, even when we dropped off, stopped having recaps for a while because of budgetary problems, we were at a point with even the public of, it wasn't the little things that people wanted us to get to. They are these things that take us a minimum of 18 months, and because of the consultation, they're bigger projects, and they're totally understandable. Coming out of comp plan, that's what our work program is going to be, and so we can get those queued up in that, and if we use this process right, I believe that we can stay on track in terms of hitting things that make a difference and hitting things that advance the comprehensive plan and the Central City Plan, and hitting things that are relevant to folks.
So it sounds like we're dealing with a little bit of an expectations gap. At what point will we be ready to start sharing that work plan with communities so that we can set their expectations appropriately?
Well, you know, it'll be in the next time that we will talk about it is in the development of the budget and the work plan for fiscal 15-16. But, you know, you all are going to be up to your eyeballs in it as we go through the comprehensive plan process, because really everything we're talking about doing is kind of being drawn from that. The same way now that we're undertaking, you know, the mixed-use zoning project, the work program we have on the side that isn't this work, that's code-related, is an example of the kind of things that we're getting into now. We've got to figure out code to implement centers and corridors. We've got to figure out code for specific centers. There's a list of these that are coming. And I'd say the big theme that we're probably going to come and propose to you all is a relook at redoing our design review processes and tools, because that's going to be important for the development of the centers. Design matters as those places grow. Our tools have to work. Maybe they do, maybe they don't now. We know already that there's some improvements that need to be made.
Mike, you have a comment?
No, I think people said what I was going to get to, and Chris articulated. I think there's a mismatch between expectations in terms of what recap should do versus, and in fact, same language. Bonnie McKnight in her letter reference forward-looking versus looking back, and I took your analogy to represent that. So it'll be interesting to see what folks have to say to us tonight.
Howard, you had a comment?
No, I guess I just want to, I think, Chris, you articulated my concern, which is citizen involvement and enough people having an opportunity to speak out before these things just move along. I just want to say that I don't want us, Joe, to be bound by schedules or requirements that get before the council in timely manner before we hear good and honest citizen input. And I know we do, and I have no complaint about it so far, but there was a lot of concern around this issue, around people not having enough time to be heard. Large or small, big or small issue. I think we're here to make sure those big or small issues are heard and in a timely manner, and shouldn't be kind of forced along by schedules to push things along and say, we had a meeting, we did it, and we're done with it, instead of being satisfied you had good citizen input.
Karen?
So, yeah, I have a question for Morgan. In one of the testimonies that we received, I just wanted to make sure I'm correct, by an Eli Spivak, there's a really eloquent paragraph. And the paragraph is, the evolution of our built environment is heavily influenced by local government regulations. For demographic, affordability, and environmental reasons, the time is right to update these rules and expand our palette of housing choices. And in fact, several of the testimonial letters are around innovative housing choices in Portland. So is this not the venue for having this conversation, that the way this person put this? Are these things so technical, so minor, so cleanup-y kind of items that this kind of question that this person has here is not germane?
In general, I would say that's true.
Okay.
There are elements of recap that will make certain aspects of that better. We're looking at shed roof heights, for instance, and I don't know if you've paid attention to some of the micro housing concepts, but I mean, not that they would necessarily run up against the height limit, but they look at shed roofs. I mean, the images that we've seen have been shed roofs. To the degree that we can make the code and its implementation better facilitated through our partners in BDS, that helps promote housing innovation. It helps developers and neighbors both see and understand what the codes and the regulations are. So I think to that degree it's helpful, but in terms of the bigger picture of what is the palette of housing choices, what are the multiple styles of housing arrangements we can have. We had a courtyard housing project several years ago. That was a great project in terms of being innovative. It wasn't a code project, it was more a brainstorm. But it was broader thinking than what recap is intended to do, which is sort of adjust around the edges the existing code.
So then the idea would be, at what point would the public be able to have a conversation about updating the governmental local regulations in order to improve people's housing?
Well,
Is that in the comp plan?
it's a question of work plan priority. It's really, that's what it is.
I don't know what you mean.
Well, what I mean by this is this list in the testimony, and Eli, I believe, is here to testify today too. These are really interesting ideas. And most of them, for the purposes of our processes and world, are not small. in terms of just the discourse that we've been asked to have with people and how long that takes. They're not that small. And so there's only so many of them through the pipeline at a time.
So that makes the
then it's
difference between, because what I'm trying to ascertain is, what's the difference between having recap conversations versus having broader conversations that encourage this kind of innovation, which we need to be open to?
Totally. The recaps are really supposed to be able to be done in 12 months, and they're supposed to not make big changes that are going to require the extended consultation that Howard was pointing to, because if it's a big deal, we need to take all the time it takes to have that consultation.
So in school district terms,
these are supposed to be smaller fixes
The-
that have some meat. We want them to be as meaty as possible, and but that we can get done in that time frame, which means really, that takes us 4 months of public hearings, y'all. It's we have to be done with these by, I can't remember what the schedule was, but by, in the next 6 months, to get into public hearings, because it just takes us that long. So it's a pretty quick turnaround for the level of, especially if we get into issues where the application of the solution is going to vary by part of town and different types of neighborhoods, because then you're going to have a lot of individual conversations about those, and those are the right way to do it. We're getting into a world where that's the kind of projects we're going to do. Those are relatively big projects. On one of the items that's on this list, the accessory dwelling units, that's part of why we undertook the 18-month project on accessory structures, because we think we can address some of the accessory dwelling units issues that are in that testimony there. So we tried to start feeding the pipeline of the bigger project that we get to do with some of the ideas that are in here.
as long as that communication gap is somehow communicated to people what the proper venue is.
Yeah.
I think that's important. And what I was going to say was, in our world, we have lots of policy, and there's policy changes that end up being on a consent agenda because in some ways they don't need as much conversation. They are technical and they are discrete. And when you're having big policy changes, you have much longer-winded processes that take first reading, second reading, third reading. That's how I'm equating this in my mind.
Karen, if we would hope that these are more on the consent end of things, but even once you get in there and start unbundling them, just like the discussion that Catherine and Morgan were having, some get a bit bigger. And
Yeah.
actually, some of these we may not come back with an answer to. We may say, we don't have an answer, it's not changing. So.
Okay. Any other questions? Morgan, are you complete? Testimony. Again, this is the hearing for Recap 7. If you wish to testify, please fill out a card in the back and turn it in to Julie. We have two individuals, John Gibbon and Eli Spivak. If both of you would come up, 3 minutes is your testimony. John, you want to get started?
Yeah. You were discussing what John Gibbon, Sweeney, Southwest Neighborhoods Land Use Chair. I have total confidence in the FTE that you put on this project because I've worked with him on the Barber concept plan, and that was a good opportunity to work with somebody of a real high caliber. Well, a lot of people high caliber. The concurrent application issue, I understand it. I've sat on both sides of the table. I mean, I started too many years ago when Jack Ramsey hadn't even become coach. I started doing land use applications, and I understand time is money, and I've lived in that world. However, I think we ought to take a look at this concurrent application thing. I know that that's not going to be bad in terms of the neighborhoods if it was disconnected a little bit. I know that it's not going to be good for the developers, but that's one of those issues we need to take a look at, and this is a good opportunity to do it. I think that the household living definition is important for us to take a look at. It may become one of those things that drops off the discussion, because I'll tell you, in Southwest Portland, one of the conflicts that I've had is this household living definition has sort of been manipulated, and all of a sudden we have a cluster of ranch-style homes that suddenly become 3 or 4 assisted living homes run by various members of the same family. And that's not a problem, but that's one of those things that maybe we need the conditional use opportunity to take a look at, because one of the things that happens with a lot of that kind of operation is you end up with a lot of pavement because there's a lot of need for transport, adequate transport, safe transport of elderly people, and there's some environmental impacts that we ought to be considering. I think that in the technical side, the neighborhood contact discussion is important, putting a time limit on it. I know developers won't like it, but then again, that at some point, if they let it get pretty stale, it's kind of an issue that the neighborhoods will be protected by. Finish up with, I'm a little concerned about a couple of issues related to the institutions, because we're getting ready to have that discussion about recycling and parking, but let's have that discussion now and begin to inform the conversation. It may be held someplace else farther down the road, but we might as well get started. And I'm a veteran of the courtyard housing thing, so if you have any questions about that, certainly direct it to me. Understand what the other neighborhoods are saying and what they're concerned about, but I'm not concerned about moving this package along today.
Thank you. Eli?
Hi there, my name is Eli Spivak. Great job pronouncing it, Karen. And I will share, I wasn't the person who provided the citizen input, but I am someone who, with John, sat on the policy expert group for neighborhoods over a year ago. We were told by staff that comp plan would implement, and then it would roll straight into zoning implementation, and it would be happening about now. So what you might be seeing is some people think, well, what's the only train going through the station? It's recap, right? So that's maybe why people are antsy to figure out, well, where do we take this energy to implement the codes we've been talking about? And last time I was involved with the recap was number 5 with some changes to accessory dwelling codes. And I've been quite interested since then in looking at what's happening in our single-family neighborhoods. And it's perplexing how we've got the smallest and most varied households we've ever had, and we're back up to the largest single-family homes being built right now, big boxy homes in neighborhoods, and it's just a mismatch. And sure, there are people buying them, but also developers are responding to the rules of the game. And I think if you look back in Portland's history, you don't have to go very far back. It was before World War II, most of the city was in some low-level multifamily zoning. There was a scarce amount of single-family zoning in town. World War II, even in the single-family zones, they let you put duplexes in it because there was a housing shortage. And then in '59, that's when single-family zones, R5, 7, 10, swept over a large part of the city. And I think we'll keep those zones. I think that's great. But that has brought with us a housing type that is really huge compared to the families that live here, really. And trying to provide ways that developers can make a good living and build something that matches the demographics of who's here is important. So the codes that I've tossed out there as ideas are just a suggestion list. I mean, some of them are best effectively additional density bonus in exchange for building smaller homes, making it easier to build accessory dwelling units, doing some, we already have some things that are good on the books, like the corner lot duplex thing, or allowing larger, older homes to be used for multiple dwellings, as long as it still looks like a big old home from the outside. If you go through Ladd's Addition, there are lots of homes with 6 mailboxes on them, and that's because it was legal at a time, and it's not legal right now to do that. So these are sort of a menu of ideas, and as I think you guys mentioned before, it's about priorities for the city. I mean, this is not the sexiest topic, but we are continuing to get hundreds of these really big 2,500 square foot homes a year going up. And just as one little stat, if you have a house that's 2,200 square foot, LEED code standard, if you knock 600 feet off that house, 1,600 square foot house, base code is more friendly to the environment, less carbon gas over its lifespan than that 2,200 to LEED standard. So cars 600 feet off and building smaller is way more important than lots of other things that get more attention. And it's a better match for homes. And frankly, in some of these neighborhoods, the only affordable housing option you're going to get is an accessory dwelling unit or a smaller cottage home. So I'm hopeful that the priority can be, and one idea I'll pitch, since I hear about this accessory dwelling, accessory structure project, is to expand that to include some ways to get some discrete infill, density, right-sized housing in neighborhoods, and by doing so, make it eligible for a planning grant from Metro, so they put the bill, because they are interested in that kind of work. I've talked to some counselors there. So that might be a way that you get to both put that on the priority list and respect the fact that a lot of the capacity is stretched right now with comp plan work by staff right now.
Thank you. Question. We'll just go around this. Howard, you go first.
Well, how do you feel about this new idea I just read about a week or so ago about the city building these small infill houses on city land? Small houses. I don't know, how do you refer to them? They're tiny. They're,
Dwellings.
what?
Tiny houses.
Tiny houses, yeah, on city land with recycled material, putting people to work to make land useful that the city owns. How do you feel about that?
I don't know. I'm going to meet the guy who's doing that project shortly. I've been on the East Coast for 10 months, so I own 2 tiny homes on wheels, and they're currently at the Caravan on Alberta. I think that we desperately need in this city something in between a tent and the least expensive affordable house you can build right now, which the Housing Authority probably knows what it is. It's a couple $100,000 right now. And if we can come up with some creative ways in limited areas to do that in between, then that's wonderful, I think. And I don't know what the price point of those things is, $30,000 or something, I'm guessing, maybe less. If you have some mass production, then I think that the city should look at that. I worked for a long time with Dignity Village when they were getting started, and heck, if people can do it themselves and we can find a place to do it, then getting affordable housing shouldn't be winning a lottery. There should be ways the market can provide it. And the market used to provide it. Boarding houses, SROs, those used to be types of housing available, in cities all across the country, and they've been systematically made illegal, same with accessory dwelling units. And we might need to bring back some of those traditional, market-based, affordable, simple housing options to our town.
Karen?
Eli, I was very interested in Orange Splot LLC. Okay. I don't know what that is. Do you mind telling me? Because you have
that's my company. I'm a developer and a general contractor. I build small clusters of homes, little communities, and Orange Splot is one of my favorite kids' books by Daniel Pinkwater, and you can check it out. It's the name of my company.
Oh, okay, because
Yes.
it's got a formidable list. And I was going to say, our ACE Academy, which is the Academy for Architecture, Construction, and Engineering in East County, is building mini homes. So
Okay, great.
it's going to be kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Chris?
So Eli, can you share with Cushing what you were doing on the East Coast for the last few months?
I was just drinking wine. No.
Oh, come on.
Okay, it was a Loeb Fellowship out there at Harvard Graduate School of Design, and several Portlanders have done it, including Mike. And it's a rare in this field to get a professional sabbatical, so it was a treat.
Okay. So, I think a lot of the ideas in your memo are exciting. Unfortunately, I don't think recap is the train for them, but I'm encouraged because reading through the proposed draft of the comp plan, I saw a lot of policies that are supportive for this. So, I think we need to work on identifying what train these are going to be on, because I think it's important that they should be on the train. And John, I have a question for you. You mentioned you were in the courtyard design competition. It's my understanding that many of the winning designs are still illegal under our zoning code. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, and I've got to be honest with you. Some of the ones that I saw, courtyard-type designs that I saw implemented were, unfortunately, the one that sticks in my mind is a nice project that completely covered up a commercial lot just on the edge of the Multnomah area. And it's 6 townhomes, which professionally I'm in favor of townhomes, but that one was one where they could implement it because it had that commercial zoning, but a commercial use there, a mixed use there would have probably been better for the community.
So there are a lot of things we got to load on trains to get where the comp plan wants to send us, so keep building that list.
Mike?
Hey, Eli, I agree with Chris, and I appreciate the fact that you brought in some ideas that we can work on, and I think this is a very high priority.
Thank you. Next, we have Marianne Schwab. Again, does anybody else want to testify?
Good evening, everyone.
I have several points. And to
Introduce
blare them all
yourself.
out, Mary Ann Schwab, Sunnyside advocate, and really paying attention to the comp plan. Starting back in 1980, coming forward, we talk about price points. I have to share with you, when we bought our house back in 1971, I made 95 cents an hour. My husband made $2 as a journeyman baker. And we went from $65 a month rent in a Neil Kelly little house, the only house he had in Southeast Portland, and bought a house, fall apart. PDC came in and helped us rehab it, and our payment went up to $157, including our property taxes. Fast forward now, 2010, it doesn't even cover my property insurance, and I live on a substandard lot. And we talk about price points. Coming into Sunnyside not long ago was a developer that was going to design some units on the back of Peacock Lane. It goes from Stark over to Broadway. I think everybody knows it's 180 feet deep, 3 lots, 3 zones, a nightmare for the developer and even for those that live close by. As you know, I've also worked on the citywide task force, no parking task force, where we did some study, 1,200 people answered our survey, and 72.4 people are going to be moving in with cars. Already at my house, 1 block from this new unit, with all the trades in there, all the contractors coming and going, you can't even park in the neighborhood. So when they get bigger, bigger, bigger and taller, we also have to think about the health issues. People have been calling me with some issues down in the Pearl. So I've given you mine in Southeast Portland. Now let me go down to the Pearl. The pile driving, your codes. There is such a disconnect. I had a brief conversation with Joe earlier today that it's like, this is my job, this is my job, this is my job. No, that's not my job. No one pays attention. No one's really listening to the community. You keep saying you want public involvement, but we can't come down here and just rant and rave for 3 minutes and walk away because we're talking to a blackboard. No one's listening to us. So when we talk about what's happening down for health issues in Block 15, Block 17, several people came down and already have been working in different offices trying to get response from our noise control officers, and there is such another disconnect. There is no time code for the construction. One woman right now is in subsidized housing. She's fearful to move. She has to show her income once a year to make sure she can live there. Reach is 5 years out in affordable housing. I welcome those little cottages to get people off the sidewalks and out of their tents and into dry housing. That's a good idea. That's a good place for the land that we own in the commons, to have a little more equity where the least people can do is have a good night's sleep, be warm, be fed. We have many meals in our neighborhoods. We have the churches opening up for night meals. And people come and go, and in the summertime, it's the same people going round and round, and that's a good thing. But my concern, again, is for the people that are so ill. And when we construct these, like that developer came to Peacock Lane, all we had was a square on a piece of paper, no schematic, no rendering, no telling us how many units were coming in. Later, we found out 105. But when the community policing came in and cited safe routes to school, they had to do a little bit of adjusting because we would have gone right through Alder Street, right through Peacock Lane's backyard. They guttered in 13 units. So then you fast forward downtown, market rate housing has air conditioning. The building this woman's in that's been calling me now several times, the 2nd floor, the 3rd floor, 4th floor, 5th floor, 6th floor, no air conditioning in their apartments. When it is stifling hot, they go to the lobby. When it's stifling hot, she'll take 2 buses because of the noise and go to the Hollywood Senior Center, or they go down to the public library. We need to look at the building. I'll try to wrap up. Everyone has the right to sleep. We don't have the right to have sleep deprivation for our workforce, for our kids in overcrowded classrooms, whether it be OLCC happy patrons in my entertainment area on Belmont, with the rattling of glasses till 2:30 in the morning and car whistles coming and going and people saying good night and having a good time. Have a good time. You've got a big job to do, but we have to get reconnected. We have to get down to the basics, whether you're sleeping in a sleep bag on the sidewalk or you're up in the penthouse. Everyone has the same human rights. And until our elected officials start couch cruising in that building, I don't think we can make any changes. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there any other testimony for recap 7? If not, the hearing's closed. Morgan? Any other questions for Morgan? Karen, did you have a question? Do I hear a motion? Is there a motion?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion. I move to approve the Recap 7 proposed work plan.
Second. Discussion? Nope. Oh, Howard.
Thank you. I plan to support the motion, but express some concern about what's a big or a small issue, what rises to the top for an 18-month discussion, and what gets voted through with 12 other regulations. Without comment about the good or the bad, I'm going to vote for this, but I want to add a cautionary tone that we are careful about what we pay attention to in the small things that really should be bigger issues if we pay attention to them. Thank you.
Any other comments? The one thing that I would ask that we do, and this is relative to kind of the public input, that we do, Morgan, you do come back to us kind of through the process and update us on that, how you're doing, and especially you had a public input process. So I'd like to know before you go and then what you heard and what the response is kind of afterwards or before the end of it, that public input process that you had, so that we see what's going to, the public is how they're going to be involved, and then we kind of see their response and are able to evaluate that response.
We'd be certainly happy to do that, just to kind of get clarity on the direction I'm hearing. So generally with Recap 6 anyways, we had a discussion draft of the, that went out to the public, and we met with different groups to talk about the proposals and sort of walk them through those. We could do a briefing at that point and kind of give you a sense of what we're hearing from the public, and then come back when the proposed draft is ready.
Yeah, I think there's two parts, not only what you're hearing, but how are you going out to the public? I think there's a concern here about in the public involvement component. I understand these are maybe small issues, but it's still a public involvement concern.
So when you have your discussion draft, maybe you come brief us and include a briefing on the public involvement plan at that point.
Yeah. Exactly.
All right.
That's fine.
Any other discussion?
I think if you make clear what this really is to people and this gap of expectation Chris talked about, you get a lot less angry people who think they're not being consulted. And secondly, you hope to be able to make sure that you direct the public to, when they have concerns and ideas to share, that they share them in the proper venue.
Yep.
That way, it allows people to be hopeful about the process instead of angry that they weren't asked.
Okay.
I just want to say that.
Other discussion items? Mike, are you?
Well, no, I'm just sitting
or-
here thinking through, will there be an explicit process that is developed to deal with these meatier issues?
I think what I heard from Joe was on some of the issues, like the accessory dwellings, there is a meatier process, an 18-month process. The other point that I would make is where Chris said the comp plan does have, in some of these items, areas where you can start to address it, but I don't know that it fully addresses it. Part of what will come out of the comp plan will be a work plan to actually address some of those issues for BPS staff, as I understand it. Is that correct, Joe?
Correct. So as you're going through the comprehensive plan hearings and your deliberations, it's a great opportunity to not merely give us guidance on the comprehensive plan, the policies where we want to go, but which of the elements that you're seeing in the comprehensive plan that strike you as the greatest priorities to get action on quickly, and where that action especially relates back to something that we can do through the toolkit that we have, which is, regulatory. So the kind of things that are in this housing package, that's a good one. One of the reasons in the one of the reasons that we undertook the mixed-use zoning project, and we did that this year, before we dealt with single-family development, is that 80% of the new units that are coming in the next 25 years are multifamily mixed-use buildings. So we know that the issues there are going to show up all over town, and we better get ahead. So we went with the one that we thought, for the purposes of the comprehensive plan, is really pressing, but we clearly hear exactly the kind of arguments that Eli was making, as well as people who don't like the character of the single-family houses in their neighborhoods and the demos. All that's out there. And are issues that we're glad to tackle. When you see it in the context of all the different things you think we should be getting on out of the comprehensive plan, your guidance on which ones seem like the ones to get to first is very helpful. And then what we have to do is, with the resources that we have coming through the city and opportunities like grants from Metro, put together a package to get going on them. And we're glad we'll welcome that input. And this discussion, the whole discussion I was trying to offer up around design review, is just our preliminary thinking on that topic. And once again, it's really driven by this phenomenon of 80% of the growth is going to be in these mixed-use multifamily corridors, and we want to have the right tools in place for Divisions and Vancouvers and Williams and the ones of those that are coming in the future. We're hearing the pressure on the single-family houses as well, and we're clearly hearing the pressure on finding innovative ways to provide mixed-use housing or more affordable housing. So all those are really good topics, and we haven't even talked about the environment yet. So help us with that as you go through the comp plan. That's more than welcome. You guys have the best chance of any commission in a long time to really help us shape several years worth of that work.
Okay.
So are you saying 80% of the housing developed going forward is going to be multifamily? 80%. Does that also relate to rental versus owning?
No, it doesn't get into that.
But 80% of the development in this community is going to be multifamily housing.
Well,
that's huge.
Well, it's big. Yeah, it's huge. It's big. And part of it's just the fact that our single-family neighborhoods are kind of built out.
Yeah.
You know, there's only a few thousand units that we have left, right? But the other thing, in the spirit of what Eli's talking about, that whole discussion of single-family houses, that takes us back into the skinny lot discussion again, too, which is a good one to have, but that's immediately why I'm saying some of these things that seem small get big.
Yep.
And just because they're big doesn't mean you don't want to tackle them. I think we should, and I want you guys to help us see the several different large things that are out there and where we should put our resources for the most effect and for the purposes of the plan.
So I'm ready to vote on Recap 7, but I just want to reiterate that we have the opportunity to bring these issues up. Staff has the opportunity, but what I'm hearing from some of the community folks in their communications is they want some kind of process that they can also make recommendations. So I'd just be curious to know if there is some mechanism that could be established that would help them get their ideas into the pipeline, in addition to what we may come up with their staff.
If I could recommend that maybe at our whole schedule is a little bit off because of the comp plan, because what Mike just raised is a great retreat discussion. It's a little bit of the timing of the year, of the cycle, when you would want to we could have a work plan hearing. You know what I mean? It could be that moment where people just bring in these issues. It'll be up to the commission and us to take those ideas and relate them back to the priorities that you're seeing coming out of the comprehensive plan. But we could absolutely do that. And in the old days, in the previous generation of Recap, this hearing that we're having now was a little bit of that. It was more about getting ideas onto the list for future consideration. And that would be a fine thing to do. And we just would want to figure out how to do it in the time to really build it into a budget for fiscal year. Which the pathetic truth is that's right around now for us. We're just starting this fiscal year, and we better be figuring out the projects for next.
Okay.
So I'm with you. I think it's a great idea.
So any other comments?
Huh?
Any other comments?
No, let's
Nope. Let's vote.
Ray.
Yes.
Howard.
Yes.
Schultz.
Yes.
Shapiro.
Aye.
Smith.
Yes.
St. Martin.
Yes.
Talmadge.
Yes.
Bob.
Yes. Motion passes. Before we move on to the next item, I would just like to recognize some honored guests in our audience. We have a group of Japanese local government managers, which are part of a training program put on by Portland State University Center for Public Service. PSU Center for Public Service is using the entire process from the visioning, PDX visioning, through the comp plan update as a case study for these individuals about engaging citizens in long-range community development and land use planning. So they're here today to observe us. And
Oh, well, welcome.
and so welcome to our Planning Commission, and we welcome you and hope you enjoy our last session. It's a briefing. The Climate Preparation Strategy and Climate Action Plan, Michael Armstrong.
You and I are doing most of the talking. Michelle made the assignments. You got the markup. We know.
Michael? Good, sir.
There we go. Okay. I'm Michael Armstrong with the city's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I'm responsible for our sustainability programs. With me this evening is Tim Lynch from the Multnomah County Office of Sustainability and my colleague Michelle Krim, also with BPS. And what we have for you this evening is two plans, both related to climate. One of them around preparing for the impacts of climate change. Despite all of our continuing efforts to reduce emissions, we are already experiencing impacts. And so we've been through a multi-year process to develop a plan to make recommendations to prepare for that. So that plan has been through public comment. It's really kind of all but final. So we want to bring it to you and then get your feedback and then on to City Council this fall. The second plan is the city's climate action plan, which is both about reducing carbon emissions and about preparing. And so these plans intersect in important ways. That plan is mid-step. We are updating it right now, and so we're preparing to go out for public comment. So we wanted to share a little bit. We have some new carbon numbers. We want to make sure that you have those. We're also preparing to go out for public comment, so we'll share the general components of that. And then we'd expect to come back to you once we've got some of that comment in hand, and we're trying to firm up the final plan. So let's see, let's go on. So the two plans then, the climate change preparation strategy is the one Michelle just passed out copies of. We'll talk through that first and then share a little bit about where we are with the climate action plan update. You'll notice that Michelle made the assignments for who's talking about what this evening, and so Tim and I are going to do most of the talking, but we all are available to answer questions. So we'll start with the preparation strategy, and I'll turn it over to Tim for that.
Thank you and good evening. Again, it's Tim Lynch with the Multnomah County Office of Sustainability, and I work to coordinate the county's part in this joint city-county effort. I was looking back to see when I was last before you, and it was during the Snowmageddon of 2013 with everyone huddled in this room, so nice to be back in a warmer environment. I'll keep this brief because I think a lot of you know quite a bit about this plan, but the Climate Action Plan was adopted in 2009 and sets a framework for the city and county to make significant community reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But it also recognized that there are impacts from climate change that are going to continue to happen despite our best efforts to reduce emissions. In fact, we're already seeing changes in the Portland climate. We've seen 0.5% to 1% increase in average temperature in the Portland region over the past century. and projections are showing between 2 and 8.5 degree Fahrenheit increase over the next century, depending on how well we manage our emissions. So we need to both continue to strive to reduce our emissions as quickly as possible to limit the impact, the future impact from climate change, but we also need to start planning. And so as Michael mentioned, about 2 years ago, we started a process jointly between the city and county to do just that. Go ahead. So this was new for the county, and at the time was new for a lot of local governments to consider looking at climate preparation as opposed to reducing our emissions. And so it was a kind of a daunting task, and so we broke it up into 3 different work groups, one looking at public infrastructure in the built environment that was led by the City of Portland, a group that looked at natural systems, so ecosystems, habitat, stream and waterways, also led by the city. And then we did work around public health and looking at human services, so social service program delivery, emergency management that the county led. And so, go ahead. So at the time, there was a couple of models that we used. One was an ICLEI-King County model that the University of Washington had supported a development of that we used for the built environment and natural systems work group. The public health piece in particular was supported by a grant from the Centers for Disease Control using something called the BRACE framework, which really brings in an element of the social determinants of health. But essentially both approaches followed a similar strategy, which is first just to gather the best science on local impacts available from OSU's OCRI, Oregon Climate Change Research Institute, University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group, state agencies, and the National Climate Assessment as it started to come out. I think that's a good example of the challenge of this kind of planning because it's happening in real time. That assessment came out about halfway through our process, and so we've been trying to pull up as much current information, which has helped us sort of hone the direction, but it hasn't really changed the findings we had. So then translating these localized impacts into specific vulnerabilities around people, nature, and the built environment, and then looking at these risks against existing programs, policies, infrastructure, things that are already planned, identify gaps, and make some recommendations about strategies moving forward. And then over that, applying a lens of co-benefits and equity to understand how these strategies are going to align. Say, for example, looking at watershed restoration as a flood strategy also could prevent an opportunity to provide access to nature. So really being mindful of how all of these pieces fit together. And actually, I would just say that we're at the STAR point, which is to make these recommendations to you with your support. We'll move forward into an implementation phase. And really just want to emphasize this is a living document. This is our first pass as it to set a foundation, but we'll continue to look at the science as it shapes, I think, no significant changes again, but just better definition about what those impacts will look like on the ground. And then also looking at best practices, best management practices from nationally and abroad. And so really what it boils down to are 2 kind of highline impacts, which is hotter, drier summers with more high heat days and warmer winters with the potential for more intense rain events. We categorize these under 5 different risks, looking at the increased temperature, which has a significant impact on public health. I think it was interesting, I think her name was Marianne, brought up the multifamily 4th and 5th story, an older adult that needs to seek out a cooling shelter already. I think that's a good example of the kind of planning we need to be looking at. Increased incidence of drought and impact on natural systems, increased wildfire frequency, which is both a stressor on individuals living in those environments, the ability to respond to those from emergency management people, and also the implications for air quality. Looking at increased incidence and magnitude of damaging floods, obviously impact of private property, but planning within our stormwater management systems that looking at the existing vulnerabilities and how we're building that into future investments. And finally, looking at the likelihood of the increase in landslides and the potential disruption to life and to public infrastructure. And I'll turn it over to Michelle to talk a little bit more about the specific strategies.
So we took all of that work and we rolled it up into the two documents that we've passed out for you today. So the document with the orange cover is the risk and vulnerability assessment, and this really embodies the sort of the summary of the science of sort of what are the projections telling us that Tim highlighted, and what are the potential impacts there. And it contains all the findings from those different groups about where we think we're most vulnerable to those impacts and what that might look like. And then the other document is what are we going to do about it. So these are the actions, the recommended actions we should be taking in the relatively near future to begin preparing for those impacts and addressing those vulnerabilities that we've identified. So those two documents work in tandem, and then as Michael mentioned, and we'll talk about later, they all very closely tied to the overall climate action plan as well, which is sort of the overarching strategy that we're in the process of updating. So the next slide there. I would say embodied in these documents are, you could sort of categorize the actions into maybe 4 broad categories. One of those categories is to keep doing what we're doing in key areas, and particularly in the areas of green infrastructure and natural area protection. A lot of the impacts that Tim talked about, particularly related to things like flooding, and heat, that the green infrastructure is really going to be key to helping us deal with those impacts. And so the work that we're currently doing is really important, not only for the current risks and issues we face, but for what's coming in the future. Another broad category is to get ahead of some coming impacts. So, you know, I think what we found is that you can't necessarily plan for the future based on what's happened in the past when you're looking at something like climate change. And so we need to look at things like our emergency plans, and if we expect things like heat waves or flooding or wildfires to become more frequent or more intense, what does that mean in terms of how we should be updating those emergency plans? Another example is, you know, the plants that we're planning, let's say in some of that green infrastructure, may not have high survivability in the future as our climate changes. And so we can do some work now to begin understanding and experimenting with different plant palettes to have healthier green infrastructure in the future. Next slide. The two other sort of big broad categories I would say that a lot of the actions fall into, one of them is monitor and research key unknowns. So, you know, I would say a lot of the actions in here are, there are some things we know we need to keep our eye on and we need to deepen our understanding of. Some examples of that include the relationship between heat and air pollution and public health. So we have a couple of research projects that we're beginning with Portland State University to look at where are the urban heat islands in Portland, where are the hot spots for air pollution, and where are the people who are most vulnerable to those impacts living, and where do those things line up? And then what does that mean in terms of the strategies or actions we should be prioritizing in those areas. Another example might be river levels, and how do monitoring and understanding how maybe increased river levels from these more intense rain events in the winter affect the number of bridge lifts, and then what does that mean for the county's maintenance program for the bridges? So that's something to keep an eye on. Another example might be as we have increased summer temperatures, how does that change recreational trends in the park facilities, both in terms of the types of facilities that we're offering and the demand for those facilities and the types of programming that we offer. Another area that's important for us to deepen our understanding of is this notion of climate migrants, or people who may be moving or relocating due to impacts of climate change, and what are the potential, you know, is there potential for people to be attracted to this area? And so better understanding what drives that. And lastly, we need to begin applying climate preparedness in a variety of new arenas. The comprehensive plan is a good example, and you'll be seeing that climate change and climate change impacts and reducing carbon emissions is woven throughout the draft comprehensive plan. Another big one is asset management. So as we make decisions about infrastructure going forward, we need to incorporate climate variables as a risk in those decision-making processes. And so it sounds simple, but it's actually, I think, going to be quite daunting to figure out how to do that, and that's one of our big actions. Floodplain mapping is another thing where we need to begin thinking about how the future might look different when we do that work. Okay, next. So both of these documents went out for public comment, and we talked to a lot of people, and we got several dozen comments back from a lot of different organizations. For example, we heard from DPAVE, Elders in Action, Wisdom Council of the Elders. Tim mentioned the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute and the Climate Impacts Group, who are sort of the scientists in the area who are working on these issues. DCLD, Metro, and others provided us with a lot of very detailed written comments. And I just want to briefly give you an overview of some of the changes that we made as a result of that public comment. The first two bullets there were minor, sort of on the surface seem like minor wording changes, but they actually changed the meaning a fair amount. One of them, initially in our first draft, we were talking about hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters, and both from the Climate Change Research Institute and the Climate Impacts Group, they felt that saying wetter winters implied that we would have more waterfall, more precipitation in the winter, and the modeling shows that it'll probably be just that the precipitation will fall differently. So we'll have more intense rain events potentially. So I sort of think of it as more rain, less drizzle, but not necessarily like big crazy storms and not necessarily more water overall. And so we've changed the language to say warmer winters with the potential for more intense rain events to be more technically accurate. The other change that we made, we often use language about vulnerable populations, and some of the comments that we heard is that the way that we were using that language implied that in and of itself, just a low-income person is inherently vulnerable. Like it implied that the person themselves were sort of somehow vulnerable or flawed in some way. And so we've changed the language to focus on the impact. So instead of saying vulnerable populations, we say populations vulnerable to heat or populations vulnerable to what it is that the impact is. And so we've tried to make that change throughout the document. We also have updated the data. As Tim mentioned, while we were doing this process, the National Climate Assessment came out and it included some updated modeling and projections for the Pacific Northwest. So we updated all of the data in the document to reflect that new data. We also expanded, we had a lot of public comment about public health and deepening sort of the links that we make to public health and as Tim mentioned, the social determinants of health. So we added a lot of that content into the document. And then lastly, we just modified some of the language to either refine the language to make the actions more strongly worded or to clarify really what we meant by the actions.
All right, so we recognize that most of you are getting this document for the first time right now, and so we don't want to make this your last chance to give us feedback on it. We welcome comments and discussion at this point. Our intention is to be ready for City Council and the County Board by early October, and then we're certainly working to integrate these recommendations into the Climate Action Plan. So these plans are mutually supportive and kind of take one another into account. Certainly as we get ready for City Council, we'd love to have a letter of support and comment from the PSC. We'd welcome your taking part in the council meeting and sharing your views there. But we also would invite any kind of written comment, or if you'd like to meet with us, give us comment in other respects over the next couple of weeks. We are still in the process of finalizing the documents for council. So with that, and Michelle ran through the recommendations, there are a number of things that are clear now. They tend to underscore the importance and urgency of following through on a lot of our current programs. There are also quite a few areas where we need to be building institutional capacity. So we are both integrating these considerations into all of our other plans. Comprehensive plan is a good example, but we're also monitoring new information as it becomes available, as things become clearer and begin to change. And so a lot of this has to do with institutional capacity at the city and county, and that takes time. I think this process has been incredibly useful in laying the groundwork for that, but it's going to fall to all of us and our respective teams to try to keep inserting this into discussions throughout the city and county. So at this point, I think we'd certainly invite questions, comment, discussion. For now, we recognize you may not have had a chance to review the materials yet. So,
Questions? Catherine? Oh, okay.
I think you did. That's why I was like, wow.
I'm having a hard time deciding if you're just thinking about a question or
I'm
you're.
thinking Mike's gonna have more questions. So, so as I was listening to you guys talk, was looking at your kind of risk and vulnerability assessments, and was thinking about assessments to industry, and kind of quickly found your other section and saw your discussion, and I haven't read it, but about food. But what about other industries, and does part of this take into any effects there might be on just other industries within the area, and what those impacts may be? So not only are we maybe going to see job migration, but I'm thinking potentially job loss in certain sectors, and what does that mean? And like, just for one example going through my head, if there's going to be shortage of water in the summer, what industries get affected by that, and do we just understand that, or just need to start studying it?
Sure, I can take a crack. I think one, we tried to limit the scope into things that were most directly in the sphere of influence of the city and county. Obviously, the city has more of an economic development role, and so there's a connection there. But I think, like with food systems, they're very complex systems, and there's not a lot of clarity about what those impacts look like, so it makes it difficult to write recommendations to plan accordingly. So I think some of those things are on the continue to monitor, and as the science and as the definition, as institutions like PSU are doing more research to help guide our actions, those become more into the fore.
I think the one thing I'd add is that I think one of the interesting and challenging things, and one of the reasons this preparation planning is so important at a local level, is that the impacts play out very differently depending on pretty kind of micro circumstances in individual communities. So, for example, as the federal government is formulating its climate adaptation policies, we're trying to remind them that you can't really do that at a national level. You really need to look at the very specific impacts locally. And so on issues like the potential economic impacts, a lot depends on the relative impacts of certain industries here compared to their competitors where they are. And so for us really to get our arms around it, we'd not only have to really understand the dynamics for the local industries, but be able to get a comparative sense of how that plays out in the other localities, and almost by definition that's very different. And so I think we tried to acknowledge there's some potentially very disruptive kind of systemic changes, but we felt it was premature to know what those would be in economic terms for specific industries. So it really does fall into that. We got to pay attention, but we weren't confident enough that we could understand the comparisons to arrive at conclusions.
Mike?
Yeah, anybody who reads the long list of suggestions I had in here might conclude that I was not an enthusiastic supporter of this. I think you guys have done great work. This was not on the table not that many years ago. That it was all about mitigation. It was all about greenhouse gas reduction, which of course we need to do. But as they pointed out, adaptation, I use the term adaptation, preparation is incredibly important for us to get out ahead of what we know is coming. So I'm happy to move this on to City Council myself, with the caveat that I did actually, a number of my comments reflected appreciation for the fact that you did make language changes in several places, that from what I always refer to as wishy-washy, consider, let's think about it, whatever, to something more active. And the only critique or negative points I have is that all of those words were changed to something that was more active. So I just would continue to suggest, I've provided you with my comments. I think this is excellent work. The one issue that, however, I still feel very strongly about, and I think has not been addressed adequately, is on page 26. And it's a new one that you added, and I'm very grateful to the fact that you did that in the strategy, correct? encourage Metro to include a focus on climate change preparation as climate-related planning policy and program work. Encouraging Metro just doesn't cut it from my perspective. I think the city needs to aggressively work with Metro to ensure that we've got a regional version of the climate preparation strategy and climate action plan. Metro at the moment is a very narrow-focused climate smart communities program that doesn't come anywhere near to what the city and county's proposing. And the reality is, to think about applying these within the city and Multnomah County and not the region really doesn't make any sense. So we need to do what we can. And Portland has never been shy at Metro to go after significant land use planning policies related to the urban growth boundary and urban design and on and on. So there's no reason why we should shy away from going beyond encouraging Metro. It may not be an accident that I got an email from Metro Councilor Bob Stacy, which I suspect may relate to the fact that this has been added into the plan. He wants to talk about the climate action plan and what's going on in the city of Portland. So I'm hopeful that's a step forward. And I will say that I complained bitterly for quite some time, and we had many conversations about whether the climate action plan should be, and the strategy should be one document. And I'm here to say that I'm really glad staff talked me out of that. That I think, this is a rare occasion, that
let the record show.
Yes, let the record show. I think that by having those as separate documents, they're both better documents. There was more attention paid to each one of them. And my only concern is that as we go forward, that these are a package and they're described as such. And you did a good job of that in this new version of the document. But it's a package. They've got to go hand in hand. So good work.
Howard?
Let me point out that Mr. Houck was an advisor to the committee, and he's got all these suggestions, so makes us all wonder. This is a wonderful plan. I agree with you, and it's a 2030 plan, and I'm paying a lot of attention to years as they go by, as I age. And I noticed that on page 15, there is a report to follow up every 2 years. I also hear complaints from time to time that we don't follow up very well every 2 years. So can we build in a real strong benchmark examination in this recommendation to the City Council that says, if we're going to do this over till 2030, let's see how we're doing in 2 years from now, 4 years from now, and let's really look at it instead of intending to do it now. Thanks, Mike. It's good work.
Sure.
Yeah, my only comment would be I'm delighted that in the strategy document, you've addressed the Portland Plan's framework for equity very boldly in this on page 13 of the strategy. And while you were chatting and I was looking through, we don't refer enough to the Portland Plan, in my opinion, nor to the framework for equity that was so delicately and carefully crafted. And on the right-hand side, where you talk about reducing risk to populations most vulnerable, that should be prioritized. You have questions 5 and 6 are really thoughtful questions about unintended consequences for racial, low-income, older people that live here. What is the impact on climate change on those people? And I just want to state that I think it's so intelligently written, and I just hope that we see this in all of the plans across the city.
And it should be pointed out that at one of the advisory committee meetings, somebody actually took staff to task for there being too much of an emphasis on equity, and Michael sat there speechless for about, I think, 2 minutes before he could figure out how to respond to that criticism.
Well, good for you. Keep it up.
Yeah, good thing we weren't there.
Yeah, seriously.
Other comments, questions?
Yes. He's replaying that moment.
I have not so much a question, but I'm intrigued by this issue of health of the built environment and the heat sink issue, and there was a recent article in the paper rating Portland very high, and I'm intrigued by it because as we look at the Portland plan, or not the Portland plan, but the comp plan, we're talking about building along corridors concentration of heat sinks, in my view. I mean, buildings, we're going to concentrate the village, we're not going to string them along. And the health impacts for the residents of those, not only downtown, but out in our corridors. And as we think through that, the other thing that intrigues me is clearly just looking at the data, this is advancing a little bit faster than I think we thought. The impacts to our built environment, to our communities in terms of the climate change. And so I'm interested of what can we put in the comp plan that starts to say, we're going to build buildings. I mean, that's part of our process, and that's the growth down the road. But what do we do to mitigate the health impacts of that built environment that are going to be here sooner than we believe and are going to be hurtful for future residents? And I we want to build the buildings, we want to grow, and we're certainly planning to do that. But how do we? I'm a little concerned about timeline because the buildings are going to go up pretty quickly. And how do we, I was just thinking when Mary Ann talked about the heat and people not having air conditioning. I don't have air conditioning in my house, and lived here most of my life and felt I never needed it till this year. This year, looking at air conditioning. But that change, if it continues, will drive that kind of economy for increased air conditioning. If you talk about affordable housing, now you're talking about increased costs to affordable housing that's not calculated today, and it's not calculated in the future because we're Oregonians. We don't need air conditioning. We can suffer through 2 or 3 days a year. Well, now we got 19, and it's kind of wearing. And so what do we do to change, and that's a health issue. How do we impact that in a comp plan? And I don't know what the tools are, and I don't know that we need the answer today, but how do we have a placemaker for that?
So to address that issue, I'm particularly excited about this opportunity to work on this research with PSU because I think we're trying to get exactly where you're talking about, to understand, so we'll be looking both at air quality and at heat, and of course those two things are closely related as well. But where are the hot spots in the city of Portland, and then looking at what's going on there, what are the characteristics of that are making that area hotter than other areas, and then to begin understanding, well, what are the mitigation strategies? Is it lacking vegetation? Is that the key thing that's going on there? Is it, what the buildings are made of, or their shape, or sort of their orientation, and understanding with things like reflective roofs or different types of pavement or depaving or vegetation, like what are the potential strategies that would be a good fit for that area that may help us to address the heat in that area. And then if you look at another area, it might be something totally different. And so I think the work with PSU will help us to begin just really, I think, drilling down into that. And I think then we'll be able to get to some of those answers, which right now, I think broadly we understand the strategies that help us to cool the urban environment, but we don't know exactly which ones to prioritize in which parts of the city.
Yeah, just a little expansion here is to think about, it's hot today, but I'm more concerned about we're building capacity for even bigger buildings, and not only downtown, but I'm looking out in the corridors, and they're not there today. And so I'm looking at the future and saying, well, can we, like you said, can we design a different type of building, or I don't know, that reduces that heat? We know it may come, but Can we reduce it? Can we create a better air quality or something? I don't know. Joe?
Well, just,
Mike?
if I could just, it's really interesting the way you just were describing it, Andre, because 80% of the growth is going to be in these mixed-use and multifamily buildings. So that whole new building type and in these places that in the comp plan we're going to be talking about at our centers is a really opportune place for interventions that could make a difference like that. And it's thinking about a whole new place and type of development, and does it make sense? Can we get even more out of it? We're looking at the scale of a whole center, not just at a building at a time. So all of this rolls back together in the comp plan as well.
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to go to Mike, and then we'll come around this way. Go ahead.
Well, no, I'll just say that we're talking about resiliency and co-benefits, and we know that increasing the urban forest canopy, which is going to be a big point of discussion in the West Quadrant and in the comp plan. Every time we start talking about intensification of development, we talk about reducing that urban forest canopy target in that particular area, and we're looking at least 33% across the city. What are we going to do with regard to the green infrastructure, the eco roofs, the green roofs, the urban forest canopy, which is one of the most efficient ways to address urban heat island, and deal with a number of other issues as well. So that's definitely one area with regard to the comp plan and West Quadrant that we need to be talking about seriously.
Okay.
So I just want to put this little thought in your brain because I don't have the answer to it, but most of these items, is that better? Oh,
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I just want to put this thought into your mind. Most of these items are all mitigation strategies. So are there also some sort of positive uses that we might find from the climate changes, whether it's big, intense rain events can generate some extra power for us, or higher heat can do different kinds of food faster or something. So I don't really know what those are, but just, keep that in your mind, and maybe there's a few good things we can do with this extra climate we're getting.
I'm going to steal your mic. I wasn't given one today. I'm going to go to a separate topic and just a more minute detail, but on page 19, Objective 3 on increasing the resilience of Portland's water supply for drier summers, you spoke of asset management, and I think it's important to have a point and an emphasis on preserving and improving existing infrastructure so that it's more efficient and more affordable for residents. So I think it's also important to tie that, both the efficiency, the asset management, and affordability of water for Portland residents.
Other questions? Thank you.
Don't change the climate till you hear from us.
Thank you. Do you have any final comments or anything?
I don't think so. I think we want to circle back on process and how we can hopefully enlist your support in doing at the city council.
Okay. We can, Julie, we can get a letter of support.
Okay. Because that was a request, a letter from us.
Yes. We can do that.
Sure.
Yeah. Is everyone okay with the letter of support? We'll circulate it and get it out to everybody. Yeah. That'll be good. Oh, okay, yeah.
Oh.
I was about to say,
Carbon.
Michael.
Carbon.
All right, so I'll try to go through these quickly and save time for questions. So as we said, we're currently working with the 2009 Climate Action Plan. We're in the process of updating that. That included a number of relatively near-term actions. Many of them have been completed, and so we're now updating that to reflect what are the new opportunities that are going to be continued. So our intent is to have the 2015 Climate Action Plan continue as a joint city-county effort.
Is your mic on?
Mike,
your mic.
Am I?
I think you're on.
I'm on.
Now it
Oh,
is.
dear. Thank you. Okay. Apologies to the viewers. We've talked a little about the need both to reduce carbon emissions, and that's the mitigation side of this, as well as prepare for the changes that we're already experiencing, we're expecting more of. This is not a comprehensive list of things that will help reduce emissions, nor is it comprehensive about the preparation we need to do, but illustrates there are some strategies that tend to do one of those or another. There are a number that do both, and so this illustrates just examples of those types of actions. We've talked before about how the City of Portland now for more than 20 years has worked to reduce carbon emissions. My favorite prop, the 5 1/4 inch floppy diskette with the original on it, we over time have come to realize, despite all our and others' efforts to reduce emissions, we absolutely need to be preparing for impacts as well. That got teed up in the 2009 plan, and we're now following through on that. So increasingly, the Climate Action Plan will capture both carbon reduction and climate preparation. The goal on the reduction side is to reduce emissions 80% below 1990 by 2050. So here's the drum roll for the latest numbers.
Wow.
So as of 2013,
Benchmarks.
there you go. So the top line there is the country as a whole. The bottom line is emissions for Multnomah County. It's community-wide. And as of 2013, we were 11% below 1990 levels. And it's about the same as we were in 2012. The 2013 numbers are still preliminary. They include a couple things that are probably kind of working against us, but I think the takeaway here is not a big change from 2012. Let me show. So this contrasts local emissions with national. The bottom line here is still total carbon emissions. The top line is population. So although emissions were relatively unchanged over the last year, population continued to tick up. And I'm going to add in what happened with jobs over the last year, or at least from 2012 to 2013. So jobs, and you can really see the effects of the recession there. But between 2012 and 2013, jobs rebounded quite strongly, and emissions stayed more or less flat. That's encouraging. So obviously we need to turn the emissions down, but this helps round out the picture of what's going on there. Kat?
Just real quick, do you have any idea what the blip in like 2011, both nationally was just slightly before? It seemed like 2011 to local.
I don't. And here's where I should have the heating degree days in front of me as well as the rainfall, because blips like that could be as simple as it was a particularly cold winter, or it was a particularly dry year, so we had less hydro and therefore more fossil fuels for electricity production. Could be a combination of those. In a little bit, you want to take your glasses off and just look at the shape of the lines as opposed to the blips, but I too am drawn to what happened that year.
Well, anyway, I guess it was interesting when you look nationally, because I think it was like around 2000, both nationally and locally, there was like a blip at the exact same time. I was like, well, what in the world was going on? That's weird. 2000. So
yeah.
Anyway, just curious. But
yeah, I don't have a simple answer. Okay, so to get a sense of how that breaks out across sectors, this is showing, and we haven't updated this one yet with the 2013 numbers, but I'd expect the same trend. I think the encouraging thing here is we're seeing reductions in each of the major sectors. So it's not as if industrial emissions have collapsed, but everyone else is up a little bit. We're getting pretty consistent reductions from sector to sector. That's really encouraging. We have continued to see big declines in emissions from solid waste, and so that's waste disposal. And that's in part, with the addition of the food scrap collection, we're getting another significant chunk of fairly greenhouse gas intensive materials out of the landfill. We also have started finally producing less waste. So these things together really help. Methane recapture at landfills is getting better. All of these things help. So waste is a small slice, but a really encouraging picture there. Okay, despite these successes, we got a long way to go. And I think a little bit the story is even here where so many of the right kinds of policy decisions have been made to support carbon reduction, even so, we've only reduced emissions by about 10%. And so it illustrates how hard this is. We really have our work cut out for us locally, as a country, as a globe. And so we really need to keep our eyes focused on what are the major levers that are going to let us reduce emissions by 80% by 2050 and have the kind of community that we all want for other reasons. And so we want to keep our eyes on that long-term game. What are the big things we need to do in the next couple of years to get us on that path? So Tim shared this earlier to highlight the climate preparation that was called out in the 2009 plan that we've now been diligently following through on. So through this process, we've been going through and updating each of the sets of actions in each of these categories. So that's the process we've been working on over the last year. A couple of the big themes that we've been trying to integrate as well. Karen, earlier you noted we're trying to do it with the preparation strategy. We're trying to do it here as well. The Portland plan has been adopted since the 2009 climate plan. Pieces of that kind of fed into the Portland plan. We now need to bring the climate plan into alignment, make it an implementation tool of the Portland plan. We're trying to do that. Equity is a big piece of that, but there are others as well. A couple of the other new things, consumption. So looking not just at the emissions associated with the things we do here, but emissions associated with the stuff we consume here. And I will share a few of those results because they're really tantalizing. We've worked hard to integrate equity, and Tim is going to describe what we've done there. And then we've already talked about how we're working to integrate preparation, and so we're not going to spend more time on that here. So just quickly, the conventional way of looking at carbon emissions at a local level, and really it's true for state and national as well, you look at these big sectors, transportation, about 40% of emissions, between residential and commercial buildings, a little bit more than 40%, the balance between industry and landfill, waste going to landfills. You know, this misses all of the emissions associated with the stuff that we consume here. And so for the first time, we were able to do an analysis with a lot of help from the State Department of Environmental Quality. Let's get our arms around what it looks like if you can capture the stuff that's consumed here. And so from that view, we still, and it's great to see that the results are in the ballpark, still about 20% of emissions from homes. But if you look around the left-hand side between stuff, and really that's kind of goods and materials, a little over 20%, food alone, another 15%, and then services, which again, it's sort of helping us get our arms around where are these emissions coming from. So with stuff, you're approaching 40%. For the most part, is not captured in our other way of thinking about this. And the other thing, and you'll see this in a second, is that this pie turns out to be a lot bigger than the other one. And so that's what we're trying to capture here. The middle and smaller circle is the conventional kind of production-based inventory, and the blue one that includes quite a big chunk of the smaller circle is the consumption-based view. And so we're trying to view this as, it's not that one of these is right and the other one is wrong, because each of them captures and reflects things we have opportunities to reduce emissions around. And so we want to look at all of our options, because if we're not looking at all of our options, we're making it harder on ourselves to reduce the emissions. So when we look at it this way, the little red slice reflects goods and well, primarily goods that are produced here and exported and consumed elsewhere. It's a relatively small slice, but it's not nothing. The green is emissions that take place here, and they're sort of part of both the worldviews. And then the blue part are things produced elsewhere that are brought in and consumed in Multnomah County. And so this combined pie is a lot bigger than the conventional way of looking at it, and it gives us more obligation and opportunity to reduce emissions. A couple of the other takeaways from the consumption-based carbon emissions, we're really focused on energy use, and that's important because that's a huge opportunity. As we look at the different phases, so more than half of looking at all the stuff that we have, more than half of the emissions associated with it are associated with making it as opposed to using it. And so, once we have a table, we got to use the table as long as it's functional. When we start to break this down by different categories, it quickly becomes clear there are some things, and so for example, look at lighting down there at the bottom. The blue reflects emissions associated with using the thing, and yellow reflects emissions associated with producing the thing. So lighting would be a great example of more efficient lighting. Almost all of the emissions associated with it are from running it, not making it. And so we really need to accelerate conversion to new lighting technologies. LED lighting is coming pretty fast, and the faster that happens, the better. So a good example, vehicles, also a very revealing part where the production side of it, it's not nothing, but it's the fuel to operate the vehicle that really dominates the emissions over the life cycle. And so to the extent that we can accelerate replacement, especially of inefficient vehicles, we're going to get big savings out of it. The others, and appliances would be the other obvious one there, and that includes things like furnaces, air conditioning, to go to our earlier conversation, but fridges, dishwashers, clothes washers, and then all the little appliances as well. For the most part, the emissions are in running those things, not making them. Note, though, that electronics are pulled out as a separate category, and that one's a little more complicated.
So demolitions in single-family neighborhoods are bad for the climate.
That is a complicated question.
Nice
In
try.
every house, there are lots of opportunities to make it more efficient, but it's not an ironclad, you never want to take it down, or you always want to take it down and replace it. It's complicated. Sounds like a recap project. Okay, so I know a lot of this is just teaser. I'm going to let Tim explain the equity work because it's really important.
Unless there's another consumption inventory kind of question. Before we move on? Okay.
Oh, I'm hiding the numbers.
You're hiding it, yeah. So we're really proud of the work we've done to elevate equity as a really core value within the plan. And so one of the things we've done is convene an equity work group made up of the 6 different community-based organizations you see here. We were able to do so. The city was smart in securing some bullet grant funds and able to support from the organization, our 2 organizations. And so we worked for the better part of a year with these individuals and organizations to really go through every piece of the draft climate action plan, every action, every section, every narrative, and really apply an equity lens. And the goal was twofold. One was they provided tremendous amount of insight and support for staff as we're trying to bring an equity lens into the climate planning work. But it was also to build the capacity of the community-based organizations themselves to start to engage more around sustainability and climate planning. And so there's a lot of earnest conversation. There's some hard conversations. I feel like I can say that it was a very meaningful and empowering process for everybody who was a part of it. And a couple of the organizations, Apano and another, were really specific about that their work and bringing an intern and some other staff to the table around this really built their capacity to go out and start to engage with their community about sustainability and climate and really become more active players in policymaking. So that was a really important success for us. Some short-term outcomes, I feel like that was just the tip of the iceberg of a bigger partnership with the community around this work, but some short-term outcomes were development of some equity considerations that can serve as a lens as we move forward. Examples of just looking at infrastructure projects, for example, how they can be opportunities for job creation and wealth building, or policy development as an opportunity to build community capacity and share power. So really just some key questions that we need to be asking as we start to move the policy forward into implementation. We also made a number of changes to some drafts, actions and objectives that were in place, really looking at ones that had the best opportunity to reflect some of the goals that the equity work group members put forth, and so we made changes to those. We also worked really meaningfully to try to integrate the language throughout the document into all the chapter narratives and really try to connect the dots between the priorities we were hearing from this group and the goals to reduce carbon. And so I feel like we've done a good job of that. I think probably the most important piece is the development of an implementation guide that will serve as a lens for staff as we move towards implementation, that will both guide a set of questions we need to be asking ourselves as we move forward with policies and programs, but it also serve as a measure of accountability to the community, measuring how we're putting these values into practice. And so that's an important piece of work that we're still working on drafting, but I think is going to continue to drive the work for a long time. And I think that's it. Move to the next step, Scott.
Sure. So we are close to having a draft that we will put out for public comment. We've continued to work with our steering committee, and I should point out that Mike and Chris are serving on that and providing good input. So our intent is to have a draft out for public comment starting in October. During that time, we'll have an open house for all comers. We'll have an event specifically targeted at businesses. And then, equally importantly, we're going to be reaching out to a pretty long list of organizations and essentially offering to bring the draft to them. I think our past experience has been when we hold an event, we get the usual suspects. When we find opportunities to bring it to other people, we start to engage more audiences. And so that's our current intention for the public comment period. Obviously, we'll take comment in all sorts of other ways as well. And then our hope is that by hopefully end of this year, early 2015, we'll be back here with a complete draft for a hearing and then on to City Council and the County Board. So at this point, questions? You know, we're midstream on this. Mr.
I saw your hand
I
this time.
cannot pass this opportunity up. This is a recommendation I made that wasn't taken. I'll make it again. You have the mitigation preparation circles and the overlap. I still contend that natural area protection, which is in the preparation circle, is also incredibly important for mitigation from the perspective that you've got great potential, and there's a lot of research that backs this up for carbon sequestration, which in my mind I view as mitigation. So anyway, natural area restoration protection serves both functions, in my opinion. But
totally agree.
For what it's worth.
Totally agree. This is
It's okay. I just say it.
Just say it.
Oh, the text. I
text
see.
fits.
It would have to be NARAP.
There you
NARAP.
go. NARAP. Duly noted. I completely agree. The text didn't fit, but
NARAP.
Just a comment. I'm glad to see the inclusion of the equity because in just thinking about food, some of the cultures, the international cultures, deal with food much differently than we traditionally do. And so I don't know if the same calculation would come out if you looked at how they handle food and produce their food and handle it and consume it relative to how we traditionally maybe do the same thing. And so, one shoe kind of in terms of implementation may not fit.
Food was definitely, one of the more difficult ones to navigate in terms of messaging around thoughtful consumption and sort of how to manage that. But there was a graph that's in the draft plan that's about relative emissions to income levels, and I think that's really important that we look at that and understand where emissions really are coming from in terms of individuals and families, and targeting our outreach and our communications that really tailor around that and around what's being culturally responsive. I think that's a really good point.
Thank you.
I have a process question. If we're going to have hearings in early winter, again before us, doesn't it make sense for whatever letter we're going to convey to City Council to be at that point as opposed to now? Or in terms of the flow.
But we're intending to take the preparation strategy to council this fall.
Okay.
And then have the climate action plan update in the winter.
Got it. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Last questions? Good job. Good job. Thank you. Nothing else? We're adjourned.
Huzzah.
Thank you.